So the title for tonight is Philippine Amateur Pornography and the Explicit Photographic Encounter. Okay, so just a run through of the topic. So in the discussion of Philippine photography, it is quite impossible not to talk about explicit images that are produced, circulated, commoditized, and propagated through various platforms, such as instituted websites, while some as private groups. Tonight, we will try to understand and contextualize the phenomenon of pornography in the Philippines, its aesthetic, erotic, and normative characteristics, and the social-cultural, and psychological conditions to which it exists as part of the Philippine human experience. Given the nature of the topic, we recommend that audiences be aware of the possible graphic content of the podcast, both in the form of photographic images and language. As part of the academic discussion, we have tonight Dr. Rupert Gel, Dicao, PhD, from the Academy of Film, Hong Kong Baptist University, to guide us through the topic. So viewer discretion is advised. So tonight, this is Photography Chismes PH. So as you would see, the page has been growing. Okay, so some reminders and notices. So this is going to be a recorded Zoom session. You will be prompted by Zoom for your consent in the recording of this material. The recording shall be uploaded to Photography Chismes PH and its various platforms, such as, but is not limited to, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, for educational purposes, in the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. This episode of the Kwentuhan session shall not be monetized. Derived knowledge from this program should be cited accordingly on the conventions and laws on intellectual property in the Philippines as applicable. This Kwentuhan session is an informal discussion and is not a lecture. Comments and questions shall be recognized accordingly by the host and moderator as applicable. So just a little bit of plugging. So Photography Chismis is available on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcast. Again, thank you, Doc, for joining us tonight. Doc Rupert is joining us from Hong Kong. So to start, what is pornography?
Okay. First of all, sir, thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be part of your program, Photography Chismes PH. So, actually, wala naman kasing clear definition ng pornography. To be honest, it's very blurry. If you will look at the legal definition ng pornography sa Philippines, Revised Penal Code Article 201 will tell us na pornography is just there to satisfy lust. So ang main function niya is it's any media form that is supposed to provide sexual arousal and nothing more. Yun lang. But if we look at the different definitions of pornography in the academic context, of course may mga magsasabi na it's nudity or it's depiction of sexual acts. And from there nagba-branch out kasi yan merong softcore pornography, merong hardcore pornography, which is yung may featured na genitals and penetration or other more explicit sexual acts. And then meron pa tayong divide between erotica, which is sex act embedded in a more how should I say this? In a more fleshed out narrative, in a more detailed narrative, whereas pornography doesn't have to have like a very well fleshed out narrative. May mga ganong klaseng distinction. So for me, if you ask me ano bang definition ng pornography para sa akin, it's sexually explicit material that ang nasa sentro niya ay sexual arousal, pero ang outcome niya doesn't have to be just sexual arousal. With the current forms and technology surrounding pornography, and I believe yun yung magiging body ng kwentuhan natin, there will be more, there are different functions and forms of pornography that are emerging these days.
So Doc, yun din siguro one of the clarifications ko, no? Is pornography an exclusively photographic phenomenon? Ano naman? So I already have some ideas, but I'd rather have you speak as an expert.
No. Of course, when we imagine pornography, it's going to be video format or yung mga photos na nakikita natin sa dyaryo, right? Sa Pilipinas, maraming newspaper na mayroong sexually explicit images embedded within them. Pero if we look at 80s and 90s, maraming column sa dyaryo yung may mga naka-detail na sexually explicit stories. Like Celex Saviera, right? Na submitted supposedly ng readers, and then the editors or kung sino man yung responsible na writer would put symbolisms in there. So of course, hindi nila pwedeng sabihin sa dyaryo yung direktang words say for genitals, right? So nagiging euphemisms and, di ba, euphemisms and metaphors yan. So for example, um, he has these words, represents the female genitalia, for example. So may mga ganong klaseng pornographic forms before. And then of course, with the advent of blogging, early 2000s, right? May mga blogs that are dedicated to sexually explicit stories. Yun din, written din siya. So users would submit, or readers would submit their own stories to the editors of the blogs. Usually the editors, hindi natin sila kilala. And then the editors would decide kailan i-release yung mga submissions or i-release ba yung submissions. Some of these actually have become more thematic in terms of any submissions na hinihingi nila. May mga sex blogs before that mainly cater to gay male stories only. So hindi sila tumatanggap ng heterosexual sex stories. It's just all gay. I think that website is still alive today. I haven't been there for a long time, but yeah, we have these written forms of pornography from before.
Just a disclaimer again for our viewers, no? So medyo iba yung topic tonight. Medyo explicit din because the nature of pornography, it's explicit. However, in our goal to define what is Philippine photography, kasama talaga yung category of the explicit. So that's the reason we're having this episode. But nevertheless, going back. So when it comes to the definition of pornography, may legal pero walang fleshed out definition and how it would be different from soft porn, tabloid, serex. So technically yung serex dati, was that illegal?
In terms of language, no. Kasi yung language niya hindi naman siya explicit. Diba? It's yung sexual intentions behind is hidden behind euphemisms and symbolisms. May tatago natin siya. But if we look at the broader definition ng not pornography but obscenity, kasi we have definitions for obscene media legally, and pornography is just one of these obscene media. So if we look at the definitions of obscene media, it will cover media that or representations that degrade public morals, um, or images and narratives that people might find disturbing or offend common sense, things like this. But there's also a question of what is public morals, diba? While in the Philippines, we might think of public morals in terms of or sexual morality in terms of Christian or Catholic sense of sexual practices like no to premarital sex, huwag manonood ng pornography, don't think of lustful things. It's more complex than we think. Of course, if we go down to Mindanao to our Muslim brothers and sisters in Mindanao, it's going to be a completely different sexual morality. Nevertheless, religion has a very strong influence on how we think of what is obscene, what is moral, what is what is sexually appropriate and not.
You made the distinction na it could be written, may narrative format, and then there's a still image, and then there's also the moving image. And I think yun nga, in the case of hentai, it's actually not necessarily indexical images, meaning they're not photographic, they're animated images, and yet it still falls into that category of a pornographic material, no? So given that, when we go now to that specific context of pornography and a photographic image, regardless if it's motion picture or still images, some would ask, especially for those who are viewing this yung nagfa-follow sa podcast, magiging question would be, how would you differentiate, at least you mentioned a while ago, the distinction between the legal context and also now we go to the aesthetic context, in the sense na yung history of photography in the West and in the Philippines and even in mass media like yung tabloids, diba, nung 80s, 70s, 90s, it shows women and siguro in some context men na walang damit. So some would say na pag nasa context ng tabloid, medyo pornographic. However, when you go to the gallery, baka nga mas explicit pa yung images. Like for example, you have Raki, diba, yung Japanese photographers who yung BDSM type of photography. And yet, it's considered as art. So now, for example, in the context of Philippine photography, how can we make a distinction? Or is it going to be fully subjective? Or no, it would be dependent on the viewer ba at the end of the day? Or how would we make sense of what is form and what is pornography?
Okay, so that is a very difficult question kasi you were able to hit something na very important. Saan ba pinapublish yung nude image, right? So usually kasi when we think of nude images in, say, on tabloids, right? Most of the time, kahit hindi siya ganun ka-explicit, say meron tayong image doon ng isang babae na say, meron siyang manipis na damit, pero yung damit niya is basa. So kita natin yung silhouette nung body. And yet we will label it as pornography, right? And then you're right, when we present it to gallery and it's a painting or a photographic image na supposed to be artistic, diba? We can revert actually to the definitions of obscenity. So meron in terms of meaning, so kung titingin tayo sa semiotics ng image, meron ba tayong makikitang inner truths or hidden meanings behind these images apart from isang image ng babae na in a sexually suggestive pose and showing the silhouette of the body. So kung ang tingin natin sa image is it only acts to objectify the body for sexual purposes, then it becomes pornographic. Kasi if we look at those gallery exhibitions, most likely meron pang ibang meanings that are being teased out there or hidden there. So to me, it's very subjective. The fact na wala tayong clear definition of what is pornographic means that it falls into the personal taste of the viewers. So kung ang tingin dito ng isang viewer ay itong image na to, whether or not nasa gallery ito or nasa diaryo to, and it offends my sense of sexual morality and sexual appropriateness, then it becomes pornography.
Kasi naalala ko rin dati, for example, nung college ako, in comm arts. So yun nga, part naman ng training is halos lahat ng form of communication. And there was one specific lecture na we were sent to the library and there was a French film that was shown to us. Ang title, Le Pornographer. Oh, so it's a French film. Pero I guess given nga that the context na in the entire domain of communication, that still has to be introduced to the students, and yet syempre it was a Catholic, diba? It was a Catholic university and it has to be parang managed. Even during that time, it was a bit difficult to understand in the sense na the film was really graphic, and yet since it was a French film, somehow the Frenchness of the film seems like it was an art film. So even in the context of a classroom discussion, it was also hindi naman confusing kasi yun nga I mean the Frenchness comes out. So in a way the formal, the language, the narrative felt it was an art film. And then we also had one exercise before. We had an assignment in college na we had to buy 1 week's worth of tabloids. So dati hiyang-hiya ako dati pupunta ako sa tabloid, no, sa shop. I mean yung sa sa mga tabi-tabi na newspaper.
Yeah.
Tapos bibili ako, tapos ang requirement nun was to read yung Serex.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
diba assignment yun, diba? Normal assignment yun for comm arts. Tapos parang ipapa-identify sa'yo ng teacher would be how is the female represented? How was the language? Parang the metaphors, you went, kanina sinabi mo yung metaphors, no? Parang it was a very graphic act, and yet because of changing the terms like yung bulaklak, hiyas, diba? Bato, diba? Parang
Right.
yung mga ganong terms, dahil because of that, in a way, it was still graphic. It was punchy. I mean, in the sense that it's punchy. I mean, it's a tabloid. Diba? The language is tabloid. And yet, it still seemed to be literature or mass literature, I guess. Mass
Yeah.
literature. So yeah, I understand what you mean na medyo ano pala siya talaga. Medyo hindi pala talaga medyo difficult siya talaga i-separate, no? So given that at least we were able to clarify na pornography might be something very subjective, no? So And sa case mo, Doc, when you were doing your research, so how were you defining the methodology in the sense na kasi since everything is subjective, so when you were doing your research, how were you contextualizing what is pornographic and what is not pornographic?
In terms of my research kasi medyo madali yung paano define yung pornography kasi I was studying yung videos sa outer community, if you're familiar with that term.
Out,
So it's outer community.
sorry, di
Uh,
ko.
okay, so in short explanation is it's it's a network or group of Twitter users, so mostly anonymous, not everyone, but mostly anonymous, who dabble with production, consumption, and distribution of self-made pornographic images.
So when you
So
so alter,
outer, yeah,
so as
as
in alternative
ALTR, yeah, alternative, yeah,
Okay, okay.
yeah. So medyo similar naman, medyo uniform naman kasi yung format ng pornography doon. So it really involves depiction of explicit sexual acts. So may mga um, meron tayong penetration and kita naman dun talaga yung genitals. May images ng ejaculation, merong images ng iba-ibang sex acts being done. So there is no attempt to artistically cover those sex acts. The more explicit it is, the better sa outer community. Although meron naman mga users na parang they try to make it as parang boys love, BL, na erotica softcore na they're engaging in sex act pero hindi pinapakita yung genitals. But most of the time, medyo hindi na medyo explicit yung depictions ng sex. So for me, in terms of methodology, hindi siya mahirap eh. Kasi medyo uniform yung format ng pornography sa outer community. So wala ako masyado naging problem with the methodology. Nagkaroon ako ng problem talking to people making those videos.
So talagang you went to the creators talaga. So hindi lang siya visual inspection.
No.
Okay, okay. And then parang in one of our conversations, I think yung ano, 'di ba, nung nag-meeting tayo with the dean before, parang nabanggit mo na even the coverage is not just the Philippines but also Southeast Asia. So it seemed very comprehensive, no? So siguro
Yeah.
mamaya I'll ask the differences. But for now, let's say sa context ng Philippines, so part of it or majority of it would be the Philippines ba?
Yung sa study ko, hindi sa outer community, yes, majority sa Philippines. Although, merong gantong mga communities that are present in other jurisdictions. Say, here in Hong Kong, I just published a study comparing Manila and Hong Kong. So I found out na sa Pilipinas, meron tayong name for a community. So yung name ng community is outer community, right? So made up ito ng mga anonymous Twitter users involved in the economies of self-made pornography. Sa Hong Kong naman, we don't have a name for the community as far as I know. Meron tayong name para dun sa mga taong gumagawa nung videos. So in Hong Kong, we call them Mongwong. So Mongwong literally um yeah, it's Mongwong. It literally is internet yellow or yellow internet. Yun yung ibig sabihin niya. Where does it come from? From the Cantonese term Monghong, which is internet red or red internet. What Monghong means influencers.
Oh,
So key opinion leaders, influencers, or internet celebrities na hindi sila celebrities that are manufactured by mass media. Ito yung mga sumikat dahil sa Instagram, sumikat sa YouTube, who are, say, some of them are doing, sabihin natin, reviews ng hotels or reviews ng restaurants or mga fashion, self-made fashion icons na they are posting or lumarang pa sa Instagram, right? So that is what we call Monghong, red or internet red. Now so to be consistent with the use of colors and yung meanings behind the colors, there was a subset of influencers dabbling in pornographic images that we call Mongwong
yun
or
yung
yellow. Yes. So because yellow in Chinese context can mean indecent or obscene activities, which includes pornography. So Mongwong are actually um, influencers who are dabbling with pornography. Pero wala ditong name ng community as far as I know. So
Okay.
very individualistic yung approach. Whereas dun sa Philippine context, meron talagang sense ng pagiging community.
I see. Given na ano, Doc, kasi ano, ngayon nakita natin yung parang one of the difference, no? So siguro ano lang, step ako ng konti dun sa Philippines kasi it's interesting na parang it's a community na parang nangyayari for someone to engage in a certain experience. There's still the communal aspect of being Filipino. I don't know if that's overreading, no, pero parang nangyayari, parang ini-imagine ko kasi culturally, yung mga syempre, yung mga I do not know. So, siguro ano, since teachers tayo, I cannot make generalizations because I don't have the data, no. But nevertheless, siguro going back to that Philippine context. So, can we call that Philippine pornography or is it just pornography? And I'm asking this kasi sa photography chismis, ang goal really is, diba, to really parang to have discourse or at least parang makapag-ambag dun sa idea of what is Philippine photography. Siguro hindi to totally ma-flesh out in the next 5 to 10 years because we need academic papers for it. We need a knowledge base how to claim and counterclaim this idea. But
Right.
nevertheless, in your paper, it seems like it is part of Philippine photography. So would you agree with that?
Um, medyo complicated kasi when we in what way is it Filipino? Of course, may mga Filipino characteristic siya. So industrially, hindi. Like industrially as in, we know there is Japanese porn, right? So it's, kasi pag, if we think of it, it's either we have Western pornography and then we have the Japanese porn, right? So industrially, meron tayong Japanese porn kasi may mga companies that are producing pornography within Japan using Japanese talents, and it's not hard to spot kasi very homogeneous ang population ng Japan, right? Hindi katulad, for example, ng say US, which is more racially diverse. So meron tayong whites, meron tayong blacks, may Latinos, etc. But in Japanese context, it's very homogeneous. Lahat yan Japanese, right? So industrially, wala. Aesthetically, sa Japanese meron din eh. May aesthetic characteristics din ang Japanese porn. Very explicit siya, very objectifying against women, pero may presence siya ng mosaic, right?
Ano
Pornography,
mosaic? Okay, na
yeah,
mosaic. Okay.
yeah. I think it's legal requirement,
Legal requirements.
right? So I've read some comments before or heard it from my classmates na it's frustrating to watch these Japanese porn kasi may mosaic, right? And that has sort of become a trademark of this national kind of pornography. In terms of narratives, hindi rin naman tama na sabihin natin na walang narratives ang porn. Kahit na masagwa yung narratives niya, right? Like naglaro ng basketball or naglaro ng baseball, then somehow nauwi sa sex. We have those very flimsy narratives. But in terms of narratives and format kasi sa Japan, may mga weird pornographic images that we see, like, babae na being smothered by octopus. And for some people to find it erotic, di ba? For some of us, we might find nakakadiri or sobrang degrading, but for some people, it's highly erotic. Now, if we look at the Philippine context, industrial, wala tayo. Illegal siya eh. Hindi tayo pwede mag-produce ng pornography. Although, it's wrong to say na walang na-produce sa pornography sa Pinas. Amateur, marami. Professional, like commercial pornography managed by studios, marami-rami rin naman. Although, nasa labas yung mga companies. And then, hindi pa natin sinasama dito yung mga um, softcore porn movies. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. I'm not sure nowadays, pero nung early to mid 2000 up to late 2000. Kasi yun yung time na nag-college ako, 2008. So, uso pa rin yung pirated DVDs, right? So, minsan napapadaan ako sa Quiapo and then I see all these DVDs na softcore porn siya, Filipino made. 'Di ba? Wala siyang ibang aim kundi i-lead tayo dun sa sex acts. Pero wala nga tayong makitang actual na penetration or genitals. So, may mga ganun tayong pornography that are, masquerading as film when in fact they are softcore pornography. Um, Ngayon, kung titignan natin thematically, meron ba tayong sense ng not pornography but good sex? Meron. Which is I think distinctly Filipino. So, natanong kasi sa akin to nung nag-PhD defense ako. So, I was describing or showing rather through images, ito yung mga nakikita kong pornography sa internet. And then, natanong ako ng isang panelist, parang ang boring naman. Kasi bakit wala kang BDSM? Di ba? Or wala kang parang mga tao na nagse-sex outdoors. Sabi ko, kasi wala naman eh. Although meron, paminsan-minsan meron, pero most of the time, meron tayong, ang idea natin ng good sex is very passionate, right? Very passionate, very romantic, very possessive, yung language ng sex, right? So this is, visually, this is how it's constructed. Na very energetic sex, very, bodies that are engaged in sex acts, very visceral, na mamawis yung katawan, things like this, without any use of extra instruments to show na, oh, we're enjoying this. Bihira ako makakita sa Twitter na gumamit ng latigo or belt or or doggy masks just to spice things up. Yeah.
Interesting. We're specifically na discussing motion pictures. So,
Right.
in the case of historical, does the pito-pito can they be included as soft porn? The pito-pito during the 70s or
Yeah. Those bomba films.
mga bomba films?
Yeah. In fact, some Filipino scholars, one of them, Dr. Doy del Mundo, I think, in one of his essays, um, said na that studios had to, and it was like one of the lowest points in Philippine cinema noong 70s kasi diyan talaga dumami yung bomba noong 70s. But I think in one of my discussions with him during our class, kasi dun, teacher ko siya sa isang MA class, I think meron kaming discussion sa class na it was an economic necessity. Kasi ang daming, di ba, ang daming Hollywood films, so nag-i-import tayo ng Hollywood films, pero bumababa yung quality ng Filipino films, hindi kaya yung competition. So, in what ways can, Filipino studios survive? So, by selling, sexually explicit films, which actually, interestingly enough, yun yung nakita natin sa 1990 sa Diaryo. Right? Dito dumami yung Cerex, di ba? And all these, I'm not saying that what I'm saying is factual kasi hindi ko masyado na research yung Diaryo. Pero based on my recollections, sa 90s and early 2000s, dumami yung pornographic newspaper sa Pilipinas, like yung Diaryo called Sagad, for example. Yan, ano yan, para siyang daily dose of nude female figures yan. So, yeah, in a way, they emerge kasi kailangan ng industriya to survive.
At saka I remember din, kasi si Dr. din, naging teacher ko rin siya sa undergrad ko naman. So, kasi ID 108?
Sorry?
ID ID 108 sa DLSU?
No, nag-masters na ako dun.
Masters.
Yeah.
Mapuwa ka pala college. Mapuwa ka college, no?
Yeah.
College. So, tama. Nga pala sa profile. So, ako naman, yung parang naalala ko naman din nun, parang one of the discussions in class was that, so yung industry, yun nga, parang kasi kailangan mo it's a cheap way to produce something, di ba? Tapos para in 7 days, makagawa ka ng pelikula, tapos alam mo may bibili. Tapos yung political context pa nung time na yun, I think, may basbas ng gobyerno kasi nga para,
Right.
diba? So panahon
Distraction.
yeah. So yun, so I understand. So at least parang ano rin, I asked that kasi to parang to give lang a spectrum, I guess, historical spectrum of from the 70s, since medyo yun din yung na-cover ng formal education ko. Pero prior to
Right.
that, wala lang, di ba? So, and then yung current nga na yun. So, I think 2021 parang lumabas, parang Philippines was number 9 in the world when it comes to traffic ng Pornhub.
Right.
So, ibig sabihin na parang, so I'm curious na parang, is it a Filipino, I mean, kasi diba you gave yung thematic, yung the agent, yung different categories of possible critique, kung you can label it as Filipino, even the industrial aspect of it na actually ako, personal experience ko, when I was working sa corporate pa, there was someone who went to us and they said that they wanted to buy high definition cameras because they were producing pornographic materials.
Oh.
That was my experience. Kasi ako kasi part of my job before sa previous job ko was that I handled a camera group. So when I
Right.
was still parang a manager and I was handling B2B, parang a foreigner or a black guy, African American, ano ba yung tama? Sorry. So African American, and he was producing films na local na pornographic material. And I think he was based in Cebu.
Mm.
So, kaya in a way, parang intuitively, so inisip ko, so meron palang nagpo-produce sa Philippines ng pornographic materials. So kaya curious nga ako na if we contextualize even the industrial aspect wherein there's an entire economy built around that desire, or at least that consumption of explicit material. I'm curious how many are there in the Philippines and how do they operate? So, but that's going to be a separate discussion na siguro, no?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
Pero
yun.
most of these are underground so medyo mahirap humanap ng data for this. Medyo mas madaling hanapin yung say mga nag-OnlyFans na amateur pornographers, pero yung isang grupo talaga that are dedicatedly producing Filipino pornography underground, medyo mahirap hanapin.
So ano, sige. So ano, at least to that I asked that to contextualize yung idea na parang people might ask, so mabuti pa yung pornography, may Philippine pornography. Yung Philippine photography wala pang definition hanggang ngayon. So I asked that just to contrast, I guess, yung in relation also to the academic literature. Like for you, I mean, you are a published, diba? You have, I mean, I saw your list of published materials. You published a lot, and it was specifically tackling pornography and amateur gay pornography. Pero when you
Yeah.
go to photography, as in Philippine photography, very little, or maybe I'm not looking in the right places. Yun yung problema ko din, baka I'm not looking in the right places. So but nevertheless, thank you for letting us know that na yun nga, na parang you've set the grounds for a very good idea of how do you call something Philippine? Kasi that's also something na sa amin naman sa department, we're also working on that. So sa AB photography, diba? So given that, Doc, so siguro bago pala we go to your specialization, if for example, given the data na, for example, 2021, the Philippines was number 9 in the world when it comes to traffic. Tapos the Philippines also was number 1 in terms of duration. So sabihin nun, what does it say about Filipinos? Is it a stretch to make statements about a Filipino psyche in relation to that data, and also if we include the information and also the academic literature related to your specialization?
Mag-comment muna ako dun sa duration kasi dun tayo nag-top Um, hindi ko rin kasi alam yung methodology behind, Pornhub study. Kasi I keep myself updated on that there. I would be careful on commenting bakit tayo nauna. First of all, mabagal ang internet natin sa Pinas. So I'm not sure if that has something to do with bakit matagal tayo doon, right? Bakit why we top the duration of staying on the site or watching porn videos. Hindi ko alam if it's because we are passionate consumers or pornography, or simply because mabagal ang internet. So that's something na naglalaro sa isip ko matagal na eh. Is it is it cultural, or may halo ba tong technological side? In terms of bakit tayo top consumers ng online pornography, of course wala akong maibibigay na definite answer to that. But let's just say na, in my own opinion, kung bawal, right? Of course, the more you restrict something, the more na naging curious ang tao, right? So we lived all our lives, we hear from our parents, from our teachers, from the church, huwag manonood ng pornography, masama ang pornography, nakakalaso ng utak. But then, saan ba natin nahanapin yung ideas about sexuality? Right? When we cannot really find any productive and meaningful discussions of sexuality in schools, at home, um, in the church, and even from the government, wala tayong mahanap na any discussion or meaningful representation of sex. I'm not saying that pornography provides us meaningful definition or meaningful representations of sex. But saan tayo kukuha, right? Kung ayaw natin pag-usapan sa bahay, ayaw natin pag-usapan sa school, kukunin din ng tao somewhere, right? And I have always come to believe na sex is a natural human instinct. It's a legitimate basic need. So if we feel that urge, saan natin kukunin yung information or yung data on how to satisfy that need? Kung ayaw pag-usapan ng legitimate institutions, kukuha tayo sa labas. And that is where pornography kicks in. Right? Hindi lang kasi erotic si pornography eh. In so many ways, pornography is actually instructive. It teaches us how to have sex. It teaches us the ideas of what good sex is. Right? And it just so happened na yung ideas natin ng sex is very phallic. Right? Very phallic, very centered sa pleasure ng penis. Right? So, ano yan, matandang literature na yan from 1970s or 1990s by the eminent American feminist scholar Linda Williams, who said na if you look at hardcore pornographic materials, very prominent yung placement ng penis in the construction of sexual pleasure, right? Kasi saan ba natin nakikita yung sexual pleasure? Sa ejaculation. But we don't see female versions of sexual pleasure or any other alternative forms of sexual pleasure. Wala tayong nakikita. It's all about the ejaculation. So, while pornography is instructive in the sense na doon lang tayo nakakakuha ng ideas about sex kasi ayaw pag-usapan sa domestic or educational spheres of life natin. At the same time, it's also reinforcing a very skewed patriarchal, very masculine patriarchal ideas of sex. So, that's why I think it's we're on top of the list kasi hindi natin napag-uusapan and doon lang tayo nakakakuha ng ideas sa porn.
The way that I noticed, Doc, no, the way that you talk about pornography, medyo accommodative siya. So, in the sense na you see it as, again, instructional and also, in a way, liberating to a certain extent, in the sense na something that you have internally, you feel, there's a desire inside you. It's a, as you mentioned, it's a basic human need. You are able to exteriorize that concept or that emotion
Right.
to an image. So, in a way, parang how I see you saying it's a more accommodative. So my question is, if that is the case, na there is virtue. I mean, I'll be very careful in saying virtue, but I for the lack of a better term, to a certain extent, there is virtue in explicit images. Then how come it is in that register of what is undesirable? So is that purely because of our Judeo-Christian institutions, including syempre the legal part, the church, the government, patriarchal society. So is it all because of that, or is it something really? I don't want kasi to include morality, no? Kasi my concern is ako, I'm a Christian. So ako siguro I'm to a certain extent I'm indoctrinated na these are things na we are very uncomfortable talking about in public. So I have to be open with you and also to our viewers, no. Na for example, for me, I'm a Christian. So when it comes to discussions about this, very fragmented. And kung meron mang mga circles wherein there is a medyo cohesive conversations about this, it's in church. So
Right.
may mga discussion of this in church, and it's usually contextualized in the sense of syempre the covenantal bond. Syempre these are the Judeo-Christian perspective, no, the covenantal bond, that sex happens should be within that context. And then I do not know when you are a Muslim, so I'm curious how the Muslims also, I mean, the Muslims would read it. I siguro similarly, and I don't know if there are Buddhists, but I'm curious on if these are sincere, basic human needs, then how is it very parang nakakahon and it's in that register of undesirables?
Right. Because if I remember correctly, um meron tayong of course yung simple explanation is matindi yung influence ng religion in how we, in how we construe not just morality but also sexual behaviors, right? Gender. Very Sexuality and gender are both founded strongly on, religion. But also, meron kasi tayong idea ng humanity na to be human is to suppress these needs, right? Including sexual urges, right? Hindi lang naman sexual urges yan eh. 'Di ba, anything excessive, right? Like hunger, right? Excessive eating is frowned upon. Excessive showing of emotions is frowned upon. But these are natural psychological and biological needs. Same thing with sex. Sex is something that should be put under control. So because we are, pornography shows us sex as something na hindi natin na control, right? So medyo meron tayong apprehension towards seeing that. So there's one. Pornography represents, a basic human need na hindi natin na control. That's one. Second is malakas yung influence ng church teachings into how we construe, in how we construe sexuality and gender, not just in the Philippines, but if you look at, Southeast Asian countries. Say if we look at Malaysia, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia, very rampant yung references sa conservative Islamic laws on how these states are legislating or regulating ano ba yung acceptable sexual practices. And that includes, of course, eschewing or avoiding pornography, right? And if you look at if you look at different Southeast Asian countries, because sa Pilipinas, it's about public morality, like pornography endangers public morality. Each of these Southeast Asian states meron kanya-kanya reasons yan why they are, banning pornography. One example is Thailand. If, Thailand would be probably the Southeast Asian country na bibigyan natin ng question mark na, bakit bawal ang pornography dyan? Samantalang ang daming BL sa Thailand, right? And if we think about affordable transgender operations, Thailand yan, right? Affordable HIV medications, Thailand yan. Pero bakit bawal ang pornography? Because nasa batas ng Thailand na pornography can endanger peace peace at society. But in what way it endangers peace, hindi rin klaro. Right? So meron kasing kanya-kanyang reasons itong states. But usually, like in the Philippines and to some extent Malaysia and Indonesia, ang fallback talaga nito is religion. Meron kasing complicity ang religion and state. sa not just in the Philippines but also in other Southeast Asian countries, merong cooperation talaga between the state and the church. And how how the state regulates the human bodies is usually yung beliefs or principles are embedded within religion.
Yung ano, siguro ano, before we go dun sa next question na lang pahabol. Kasi for example, within states, there are the cosmopolitan areas and then there's the more provincial. And then there are the indigenous areas. I'm curious, in the Philippines, is there such a thing as indigenous pornography in the sense that wala or if it exists, how is it demonstrated? I mean, I'm thinking of pornography based on what we have discussed so far, that it's something that is produced and consumed and there is a system, and then um the value judgments in relation to it are within the context of what is good and what is bad to a certain extent. Pero I'm not discounting the other things that you mentioned na to a certain extent it's liberating, it's instructive. But I'm curious of, this is not in the guide questions, but is there such thing as parang indigenous pornography, given that the technology we now have in the cosmopolitan areas is available in the provinces and even the indigenous areas wherein they have cell phones, they have cell sites, they have access to the same globalized system of information that we have in the cities.
That's a good question that I don't have any answer.
Baka ano, no?
Sorry.
Baka ano for future studies, no?
Yeah.
So yun.
I,
So,
I'm not sure though. I'm not sure, but it's a very good question.
kasi parang naku-curious ako na parang um, assuming for example sa indigenous groups, syempre they maintain yung ano nila, no, yung not old, sorry. They maintain yung traditional systems of belief nila, and it's not Judeo-Christian, diba? So I'm curious on how they would see pornography, given that their lens in viewing pornography would be something more indigenous or local to that area.
Right, right,
Ayan.
right.
Siguro sa future, no, siguro i-research ko rin yan parang, pero tatanong ko muna sa iyo kasi ikaw yung specialist, no.